people out there are like, abolish the UN and all that. It's a reactionary thought because it has lost a lot of trust and made a lot of mistakes, especially over the past couple decades in particularly. But to me, it's like we saw what happened when we failed with the League of Nations experiment and what that led to when you don't have something where there's some semblance of making high-level decisions in some sort of transparent way. And I don't want to see that happen.
Exactly. And, this having a venue in which peace and security issues at the highest level, in which there's like this standard diplomacy taking place. You don't have to pay this high political cost to get to diplomacy. You actually have it automatically.
Right.
Is crucial. And 30 years ago, the Secretary General was a much more important figure than he is today.
Why do you say that?
Because back then, whenever there was a conflict, the automatic first place to go to find a mediator was the Secretary General. He automatically almost had the trust of the key parties. You didn't have to search for a mediator. You didn't have to wait for like some country to find itself in a comfortable political situation to be able to have the bandwidth and the political maneuverability to step up and offer to be a mediator. There was the Secretary General. So Ukraine happened, he would be in there right away. We don't see that any longer. And it's largely, not entirely, but it's largely because
Okay. এখানে কিছু বিষয় বলার আছে যে যা বলতেছে এখানে কিছুটা সত্যতাও আছে যে তুমি যদি 2014 সালের আগের থেকে তুমি চিন্তা করো ইউক্রেনের যুদ্ধের পরের থেকে বা এর আগের থেকে যে দুনিয়াটা আসলে ছিল সোভিয়েত ইউনিয়নের তুমি পুরা চ্যাপ্টারটা যদি তুমি দেখো দুই সুপার পাওয়ার মিডলে কিন্তু আসলে ইউনাইটেড নেশন অনেক বড় একটা ভূমিকা পালন করছে। এখন ইউনাইটেড নেশনকে আমরা অনেক আসলে সেপারেট এন্টিটি হিসেবে দেখি ওয়েস্টার্ন সিভিলাইজেশনের, যদিও ইউনাইটেড নেশন অলওয়েজ একটা ওয়েস্টার্ন সিভিলাইজেশনের বা ওয়েস্টার্ন যে এজেন্ডা ছিল লিবারালিজম, ফেমিনিজম, ঠিক আছে, দেন ইকোনমিক যেই ক্যাপিটালিজম, ইকোনমিক যত পলিসি আছে এই সবকিছুর কিন্তু একটা সুন্দর মিশ্রণ ছিল। বাট ওইখানে না দিন শেষে আফ্রিকান রাষ্ট্রগুলো বা এশিয়া রাষ্ট্রগুলো, মুসলিম রাষ্ট্রগুলো, ঠিক আছে, মিডল ইস্ট থেকে শুরু করে সেন্ট্রাল এশিয়া ইনক্লুডিং চায়না কিন্তু অনেক বেনিফিশিয়ারি ইউনাইটেড নেশনের তোমার এই ইনস্টিটিউটের মাধ্যমে। সো একেবারে জিরোর সাথে কনভার্ট করাটা আসলে যেরকম উচিত না, যেটা আমরা আসলে অনেকে করি। প্লাস আবার এটাকে ওয়েস্টার্নরা এখন যতটা বেশি ডিফেন্ড করতে চায়, এর কারণ কি দেখো, যে যাই বলুন দিন শেষে এই ইনস্টিটিউটটা কাজ করতেছে না এখন, এবং মোস্ট প্রবাবলি আগে আর কাজ করবে না। কোনো সময় বিগ পাওয়ারদের মাঝে কিন্তু কোনো কনফ্লিক্ট যদি হইতো বা হওয়ার থাকতো, ওইটা কিন্তু সে সরানোর মতন ক্যাপাসিটি রাখে না বা হওয়ার কথা না। স্বাভাবিক, আমরা আগে বলছি ইউনাইটেড নেশন এটা কোনো রাষ্ট্র না, এটা কোনো স্পিরিচুয়াল বডিও না, এটা লিটারালি জাস্ট অনেকগুলা ল মেকার বা অনেকগুলা স্পিকার, অনেকগুলা মিডিয়েটর বৈশা আছে কিছু না কিছু সংশোধনের জন্য, এবং মোস্ট অফ দ্য টাইম তারা কোনো কিছু সংশোধন করতে পারে না। ঠিক আছে, এখন এর মানে কিন্তু এই না যে আসলে এটা কোনোই বেনিফিশিয়ারি দেয় না ছোট রাষ্ট্রগুলোকে। আমি আগেই বললাম যে সুপার পাওয়াররা কিন্তু কোনো সময় ইউনাইটেড নেশনকে এজ এ তোমার কি বলে কম্পিটিটিভ না, এজ এ রিলায়েবল বা এমন কোন ট্রাস্ট ওয়ার্দি ইনস্টিটিউট হিসেবে ধরে নাই যে এটা তোমার ইন্ডিপেন্ডেন্ট কোন অ্যাক্ট করবে। এটা সামহাও না বিভিন্ন সুপার পাওয়ারের ছোট 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 তোমার বলতে পারো ইনফ্লুয়েন্সের মাধ্যমে আসলে চলাশুরু করতো এবং চলতো। সো দ্য পয়েন্ট ইজ যে যখন ওয়েস্টার্নাররা এখন কিছু বিভিন্ন ফ্যাকশন হয়েছে, কিছু আছে রিয়েল পলিটিক্স আছে যে তারা বলতেছে ইউনাইটেড নেশনকে ইউজ করো যখন প্রয়োজন হয়, যখন আমাদের স্বার্থে আসে। কিছু কিছু বলতেছে যে না, ইউনাইটেড নেশন অ্যাজ ইনস্টিটিউট আর কোনো ভ্যালু নেই, এটাকে তুমি বাতিল করে দাও, শেষ করে দাও, এটা থেকে বের হয়ে আসো। আবার কিছু কিছু বলতেছে যে না, এটাকে এখনো রিরাইট করে টিকায় রাখার মতন ক্যাপাসিটি আছে, এটার অনেক বেশি ভ্যালু আছে, একটা লেগেসি আছে, ব্লা ব্লা। ঠিক আছে, ব্লা ব্লা। ওই সিস্টেম যদি চিন্তা করো যে এখন ইউরোপিয়ানরা ইন জেনারেল, ওয়েস্টার্নরা বলতে আমি বলবো আমেরিকানরা এত বেশি আসলে রোম্যান্স বা ইউনো ওই রোম্যান্সের যে অংশটুকু তারা এখন পুরোপুরি কাট অফ করে দিচ্ছে। তারা এখন আসলে কোনো কিছু প্রিভেন্ট করতেও ইচ্ছুক না, যে আমেরিকা সুপার পাওয়ার না, আমেরিকা এম্পায়ার না, আমেরিকার একটা রিপাবলিকান, আমেরিকা একটা নেগেটিভ বিল্ড করবে। ইন্টারেস্টেড ট্রাম্পের যে এটা আসলে চলছে লাস্ট 10 বছর ভিতরে, বাইডেন যদিও অনেক বেশি সফট ছিল বাট সামহাউ আমেরিকানরা কিন্তু ওইভাবে বিহেভ করতো। মানে ট্রাম্প যেটা ট্রিগার করছে, ওই ট্রিগারের বাইরে খুব বেশি মাত্রায় কিন্তু বাকিরা তোমার যায় নাই, যাওয়ার চেষ্টা করেনি। সো যা বলার চেষ্টা করতেছি তা হইল যে ট্রাম্প আসলে যা শুরু করছে এটা শুধু ট্রাম্পের জন্য নয়, আমেরিকার ইন্টার এলিট সোসাইটি বা এলিট ক্লাস হয়তো বা তাই চায়। এবং দুনিয়া দিন দিনকে তোমার ওই এলিট ক্যাপচারের দিকে আবারও যাওয়া শুরু করছে, যেটা তোমার এম্পায়ারদের সময় হইতো, যে কিছু মানুষ সব সিদ্ধান্ত নিত, যেটা মোস্ট অফ দ্য টাইম ছিল। বাট সামহাও না মানুষদেরকে খেলার একটা সুযোগ দিত ডেমোক্রেসির মাধ্যমে। বাংলাদেশের মতন একটা অবস্থাও কিন্তু এখন বাংলাদেশে যাওয়া কিন্তু ওই পথে আসলে হাঁটা শুরু করছে। এবং ওই জিনিসটা ইউরোপিয়ানরা আসলে ওই সিস্টেমের উপরে একটা সিস্টেম আসলে বিল্ড আপ করতে পারছে, যেখানে তারা অ্যাটলিস্ট বলার জন্য হইলেও অনেক কিছু আসলে প্র্যাকটিস করছে, মানুষদেরকে প্রিচ করছে, প্র্যাকটিস করার সুযোগ দিয়েছে। এবং ওইখানে জেনুইন মানুষও আছে যারা সত্যি এই আইডিয়াগুলোকে বিশ্বাস করতো। ইউরোপিয়ান ওই মানে স্পেশালাইজেশনের উপরেও, যে ইউরোপিয়ানরা ছাড়াও বাকিরাও তোমার বিভিন্ন রাইট ভোগ করতে পারে। বাট সামহাও ইউরোপিয়ানরা আসলে তোমার লয়ার ছিল, ল মেকার ছিল। সো তাদের ভালোবাসা ইউনাইটেড নেশনের প্রতি বা ইন জেনারেল যে ইউরোপিয়ান একটা পরিচয় আছে, তাদের যে প্রিচার আছে, দেন ডাইভার্সিটি তারা যে পরিমাণ অ্যাডাপ্টেশন করছে। সো যে কোনো মানুষ হিউম্যান রাইট চাওয়া, ইউনো একটা কালচারাল ভাইব আছে, ওইটার ভিতরে একটা অরা আছে। সো ইউনাইটেড নেশনকে সবাই ইউজ করছে অ্যাজ এ মিডিয়েটর বা একটা সেমিনার ক্লাসের মতন, যেখানে সবাই এসে বসতো, কথা বলতো, যে জিনিসটা থ্রু আউট হিস্ট্রিতে হয়নি কখন। এবং এখন যে হইতেছে ওটার জন্য ইউনাইটেড নেশনকে ক্রেডিট দিতে হবে, এটা নো ডাউট। এবং ইউরোপিয়ান এটার ফ্রন্টে ছিল। আমেরিকানরা যদিও, আমি বলছি আমেরিকা নিজে অনেক বেশি তোমার ভিন্ন বইতে অ্যাক্ট করছে, যার ফলে আমেরিকা কোনো সময় না খুব বেশি ইন্টারেস্টেড ছিল না যে ইউনাইটেড নেশনকে নেওয়ার জন্য। এবং দ্বিতীয় বিশ্বযুদ্ধের আগ পর্যন্ত কিন্তু মনে রাখবা আমেরিকা যদিও এজ এ এন্টিটি হিসেবে হিউজ হয়ে গেছিল, বিশাল বড় বড় এম্পায়ারের সাইজ হয়ে গেছিল, এবং কোন কোন ক্ষেত্রে ইউরোপিয়ানদের থেকেও বড় পাওয়ারফুল হয়ে গেছে, যেটা তোমার আমরা এখন জানি। অবশ্যই তার হয়ে গেছিল, বাট তাদের ভিতরে না একটা ইনফেরিয়রিটি কমপ্লেক্স কিন্তু আসলে ছিল, এবং তারা ওই জিনিসটাই ভুগতো। আমেরিকানরা তারা সামহাও ইউরোপিয়ানদের কাছ থেকে, তারা আসলে ইউরোপিয়ানদের কাছ থেকে একটা ইউনো তোমার ভ্যালিডেশন চাইতো, যে ইউরোপিয়ানরা যতদিন বা যতক্ষণ পর্যন্ত আমার এই কাজটাকে ভালো মন্দ কোনো কমেন্ট না করবে, ততক্ষণ পর্যন্ত আমার ওই কাজটা অসম্পূর্ণ বা সম্পূর্ণ হয় নাই। সো আমেরিকা যখন দ্বিতীয় বিশ্বযুদ্ধের পরে সুপার পাওয়ার হয়েছে এবং আস্তে আস্তে বিভিন্ন অ্যাক্ট করা শুরু করছে, এবং 60 থেকে 70 এই যে যে 20-25 বছর যেটা আমেরিকা আসলে পুরো দুনিয়াতে যেভাবে তার নেভি পাওয়ার আসলে শো করছে, এবং আমেরিকা যখন রিয়েলাইজেশন করছে যে আমরা ইউরোপিয়ানদের থেকে বেটার সবকিছু করতে পারি। কারণ ইউরোপিয়ানদের কাছে কি ছিল? ইতিহাস ছিল। ইউরোপিয়ানদের সিভিলাইজেশনের অংশ আমেরিকা নিজেদেরকে বলে, রোমানদের অংশ। সো সামহাউ ইউরোপিয়ানরা যত বেশি ভ্যালিডেশন আমেরিকানদেরকে আসলে দিত, তার থেকে অনেক বেশি আমেরিকা নিজে ওই ভ্যালিডেশনে পাওয়ার যোগ্য হয়েছে। এবং আস্তে 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 ওটা ট্রিগার করতে 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 আমরা এখন এমন একটা পর্যায়ে আসছি যেখানে আমেরিকা এখন বলতেছে যে নিউ ওয়ার্ল্ড অর্ডারে আমরা যাব, বাট ওইখানে শুধু আমেরিকা থাকবে। মানে আমেরিকা অ্যাবসলিউট ডমিনেন্স থাকবে, দেন রেস্ট পাওয়ার থাকবে, যেটা ইউরোপিয়ানদের একটা প্রিচিং এর মাধ্যমে বিল্ড আপ করা হয়েছিল যে স্টুডেন্ট গুলা, এগুলো এখন সামহাও আমেরিকা নিজেও ইচ্ছুক না ক্যারি করতে, কারণ এগুলা ক্যারি করার বার্ডেন, এগুলাকে ক্যারি করার যেই এক্সপেন্স এটা অনেক বেশি আমেরিকানদের জন্য। সো সামহাও যখনই আমি এখন এই টাইপের কোনো ক্যারেক্টার দেখি যে ইউনাইটেড নেশনকে রিশেপ দেওয়ার চিন্তা করতেছে, ছোট মোটো তোমার পরিবর্তনের চেষ্টা করতেছে, সো আমি তাদের ওই অ্যাঙ্গেলটা আসলে বোঝার চেষ্টা করি এবং বুঝতেও পারি যে ইউনাইটেড নেশন ট্রুলি অনেকের জন্য অ্যাডমায়ারেবল ছিল, ওই সেন্সে যে যারা লিবারালিজম তোমার গিলছে এতদিন, তারা সত্যি বিশ্বাস করে ওইসব কথায়, যা ইউনাইটেড নেশন বলে, যেসব চার্টার, এখন এগুলো যে এম্পায়ার পলিটিক্সে বা রিয়েল পলিটিকে খুব বেশি ম্যাটার করে না এটা তারা জানে, বাট সামহাও ওই জিনিসটাকে তারা মানতে ইচ্ছুক না বা এড়ানোর চেষ্টা করে যে না আরো কিছুটা সময় থাকতে পারে কিনা ইউনাইটেড নেশন, আরো কোনো পসিবিলিটিস আছে কিনা। সো এই হলো আসলে তোমার পয়েন্ট, যেটা আই হোপ এখন সবাই জানে যে এই জিনিসটা কতটা ডিফিকাল্ট ক্যারি করা। সো ইয়া, আমরা কন্টিনিউ করি। সো এই পডকাস্টে বা এই প্রথম ফেজ আসলে তুমি যা দেখবা যে তাদের কান্না এই জন্য যে তারা এটাকে আসলে অনেক বেশি কাছ থেকে লালন পালন করছে, ইউরোপিয়ানরা স্পেশালি। সো যখন ট্রাম্প ইউরোপিয়ানদের সামনে গিয়ে তোমার লেকচার দেয় এবং তাদেরকে থার্ড ওয়ার্ল্ড কান্ট্রির মতো ট্রিট করে, ওই জিনিসটা কিন্তু তারা দিতে পারে না, কারণ তারা মনে করে যে সিভিলাইজেশন, যে ওয়ার্ল্ড অর্ডার তুমি বিল্ড করছো, এটা লিটারালি টিচার আমরা প্রিচিং করতেছি, আমরা ইন্টার মানে তুমি গ্লোবকে আমরা শিখাইতেছি, তুমি আমাদেরকে এসা ট্রিট করতেছো থার্ড ওয়ার্ল্ড কান্ট্রির মতন, এই জিনিসটা আসলে তারা নিতে পারতেছে না। কারণ আমেরিকাকে ইউরোপিয়ানরা এখনো শুধু একটা মিলিটারি ফোর্সের মতো মনে করে, বাট মনে করে এই ফোর্সটা আমাদেরকে প্রোটেক্ট করার জন্য, আমাদের এই সিভিলাইজেশনকে প্রোটেক্ট করার জন্য। যখন আমেরিকা বলতেছে যে ইউরোপিয়ানদেরকে আমরা এখন আর কেয়ার করি না, ইউরোপিয়ানরা মরে বাঁচে, ওই কথাগুলো সে নিতে পারে না, ওই কথাগুলো সে তার অনেক বেশি হার্ড হয় যে এটা কিভাবে সম্ভব যে আমার সিভিলাইজেশনে তুমি প্রবেশ করছো, আমার থেকে ভ্যালিডেশন নিতে এতদিন, তুমি এখন আমাকে কথা শুনাইতেছো। ওই জিনিসটা তুমি ইউরোপিয়ানদের অ্যাঙ্গেল থেকে চিন্তা করো যে ইউরোপিয়ানরা কেন বিষয়গুলোকে এত এগ্রেসিভলি আসলে বিহেভ করতেছে, বিকজ তাদের জন্য ডেমোক্রেসির থেকে বড় কথা হইলো যে ইন্টায়ার প্র্যাকটিস তোমরা লাস্ট 80 বা 100 ইয়ার্স করতেছে, এগুলো আমরা বিল্ড আপ দিছি, এগুলো আমাদের দ্বারা হইতেছে। সো আমেরিকা চাইলেই আমাদেরকে আসলে এইভাবে ডিভোর্স দিতে পারে না, যদিও ডিভোর্সের জন্য তুমি ইকুয়াল মনে করো, বাট ইউরোপিয়ানরা সামহাও আমেরিকার থেকে বেশি নিজেদেরকে ওই সিভিলাইজেশনের বা আমেরিকানরা যা বিল্ড আপ করছে ওটার মূল অংশ মনে করে। এখন তুমি যদি ওইগুলো দ্বারা ইউরোপিয়ানদেরকে ছোট করার চেষ্টা করো, তখন তারা এইভাবে এগ্রেসিভলি রেসপন্স দেয়। বাট যে যত কথাই বলুক, আমার কাছে অসম্ভব লেভেলে ভালো লাগে এবং এই সার্কাস আসলে আমি চাই আরো কন্টিনিউ হোক। ঠিক আছে, এগুলা আসলে খুবই ভালো আমাদের মতো দেশগুলোর জন্য। এখানে দুটো অংশই আছে, খারাপের অংশ আছে, বাট ভালো ওই সেন্সে যে আমরা অনেক কষ্ট করছি, আমরা অনেক বেশি সাফার করছি, মেবি আরো করতে হবে, বাট আমি তোমাকে সাফার করতে দেখতে চাই ওই সেন্সে যে তুমি এতদিন আমাদেরকে যে বিষয় ভুগাইছো এইসবের বাইরে, এইসব ট্যাগের লাইনের বাইরে, এখন তোমাদেরকে আমেরিকা ওই সেম ওয়েতে ট্রিট করতেছে, তোমরা তোমাদেরটা বুঝে নাও। সো ইয়া, ওকে, আমরা আবার চলে যাই।
Because of also the great powers, they've kind of pushed the Secretary General out
Right.
and diminished his role. And now we see the consequences of that.
Are you allowed to talk about what we talked about just before camera regarding like one of the ideas you have for reform?
Sure. Yeah,
you are?
Yeah.
So specifically, because obviously you guys didn't hear that conversation we were having, but you were explaining to me that it sounds like a really reasonable compromise to me. One of the issues that we always hear about is the fact that 5 countries have a veto vote that can just totally shut something down regardless of what everyone else thinks. And you have an idea to like I would say, soften that a little bit? And what does that look like?
So you have a position by many countries saying there should not be any veto at all, that the veto really is unfair, that it's blocked progress, etc. And, it's an understandable position. Perhaps in an ideal world, there would not be a veto in the first place. But reality, the veto is there. And the veto holding countries are never going to give it up. It's just not going to happen. In fact, most of them will probably prefer to see no reform of it at all because they benefit from having it. But unless we have some reform of the UN, particularly the UN Security Council, which is not just the veto, it's composition and size, it is reflecting the world as it looked in 1945. The world has changed tremendously. Even if it had been formed in 2010, it would have already been outdated given how fast things are changing. But 1945, we might as well have based it on the geopolitical realities of the time around the life of Jesus Christ, frankly. That's how outdated it is. Yes. So you need to change that. But within that, there's got to be something also on the veto in our view. So one of our proposals, and we have a whole package of different proposals that are being quite seriously considered right now in this process of potentially getting some change, is what we call veto plus one, which is that each and every veto that is cast by any of the P5 needs to be accompanied with one other negative vote by any other member. And it doesn't have to be a permanent member. It could be just one of these elected members that comes in there for 2 years. If it is, then it is insulated and it stands. But if it isn't, if it's just that permanent member casting a veto and no one else casting a negative vote, then the matter goes to the General Assembly. And then 2/3 of the General Assembly can vote to overturn the veto, and that causes the original resolution to automatically pass. In the last couple of years, we have examples of 8 vetoes. 6 by the US on Gaza, 2 by Russia on Ukraine. All of them were completely alone. All of them most likely would have been overturned if our reform had been in place. And much of what we talk about right now about the UN is not working, etc., is precisely because of those 8 vetoes.
That's why, because those are the 2 major wars going on in the world that, for obvious reasons, and correctly so, are incredibly controversial. Obviously, there's like a ceasefire in Gaza right now, but you know what I mean? It's like, there's got to be, what you're talking about is not, to me, a big ask. And I'll bet it's not really what you want, but you're compromising to at least get something moving, which I can appreciate, instead of like trying to be 0 or 100 and sitting there to get nothing done and nothing changes.
Yeah. And look, even though I agree with you, it is a compromise at the end of the day, it's still a huge ask because many of the permanent members don't want to see any change whatsoever to the veto.
That was my next question, though. How would you get this change to happen if you need them on board, and how does that work?
So ultimately, it then comes down to the fact that the situation is getting to a point in which you either have reform or collapse. I don't think that outside of a fear of collapse, the reform actually would take place, right? Because you have to be in a situation in which everyone realizes, okay, we got to change this or we all lose. Some lose more than others. In our view, or in my view personally, the United States and the other permanent members actually have the most to lose, because they're the ones who would lose the very strong privilege of having a veto if there isn't a Security Council, right? So I think we do have an incentive on our end, making sure that the council stays alive and relevant. And if that then means some give on the veto, that obviously is not as far as abolishing the veto, which frankly a majority of countries probably would have wanted, then I think ultimately when the moment of truth comes, in which is either reform or collapse, I think we'll make the right decision. But we also have to realize up until that point, it's probably not going to happen. But we are getting very close to that moment in which either there is some form of reform, or this is either going to collapse or just fade into irrelevance.
Serious dictation was driving me crazy, so I switched to whisper flow. Here's why I'll never go back. First off, it actually gets it right. Watch what Siri does with this. Can you share the mirror board, export the content?
You're involved. This is pretty important. It's very impressive. Like, you obviously, as a originally native Iranian, which we'll get to Trita's whole story as well today. I definitely want to do that. But, I'm sure that's the most passionate subject and drives a lot of what you do. But whether it be trying to make reform in the UN, which affects all these countries around the world, or working on MEK, which I guess is like Iran/Albania. We'll get to that in a second. Or, I mean, it's fun to say, Viva la Revolution and all that, but
yeah, there's a romanticism around it. But I think people forget that it is so disruptive. Like, in the case of Iran, you could have a completely well-established position, a degree from university, very valuable. But now a revolution has happened, and suddenly they don't even accept the previous degrees. Like, your entire education wiped out. And you're still one of the lucky ones because you didn't get killed, you didn't get into prison or anything like that.
Ever heard of Blue Lotus? It's honestly like a better version of cannabis for some people, and it actually works. This is what people don't realize about
how you build a new story. Do you have a plan to make sure that this transitions in a peaceful manner, that you actually get to a better situation? Iran's experience after 79 was change led to something worse.
Right.
The revolution in Tahrir Square in Egypt, 2011, same slogan. The only thing they focused on was that Mubarak had to go. Same slogan in Iran, 79, 78. The Shah must go. What comes afterward? Not well defined. And then we saw that, they had tremendous amount of turmoil, and now they're pretty much back to a different version of the same type of a dictatorship that they had before. And of course, even worse situations in Syria or elsewhere, we have a complete civil war, ranging on for 15 years. A lot of Iranians, in my view, have a very unrealistic and high view of Iran and thinking that no, that could never happen in Iran. That, for whatever reasons, the Iranians are different, better than the Syrians or the Iraqis for whatever reason, whether it's less sectarian strife or whatever, and as a result, they wouldn't have a civil war. I think that's absolute nonsense. You have civil wars in countries that don't have different ethnic groups or sectarian divisions. It's not dependent upon that. And what I see in Iran right now is all of the ingredients that very much could lead to a civil war if not handled and managed correctly. And again, what the regime is doing right now with the massive killings, these are things that just drive things actually further towards civil war.
So when you say civil war specifically there, you are referring to a rise up of the part of the country that wants to get rid of the current regime rather than a civil war that would occur after said regime is already gone?
No, or both cases. You could have an effort in which there's a violent uprising. And that can then lead to civil war because, the existing government would fight back. They have monopoly on power, so they would strike back. Could end up being more of an insurgency than a civil war, or a scenario in which the state collapses. There's no centrality of power. And then there is a massive power struggle of who takes over, who establishes order afterwards. And in that scenario, you can also have it. And in Iran, actually is a country with a tremendous amount of different minorities on the border areas. There are also minorities that have a history of seeking independence or secessionists. Like who? The Kurds, for instance, the Baluchis towards the east, border of Pakistan, the Kurds towards the border of Iraq and Turkey. You have Azeri minorities that historically there has been, but I don't think it's this is roughly 25% of the population, and it's also very much part of the elite. The current supreme leader himself is an Azeri, so it's not comparable to the Kurdish minority.
How do you spell that word?
Azeri? Yeah, Azeri, from the Iranian part of Azerbaijan. So that risk is there. In fact, in these last days of protest, some of the earliest and most significant clampdown and violence was in the Kurdish areas. One of the Kurdish groups that was deeply involved, which is not part of a democracy movement or so. It's actually a Kurdish group that was trained by the United States in 2014 to fight ISIS.
Peshmerga?
No, it's a group called PAK.
Okay.
They were trained by the U.S. in 2014 to fight ISIS. It's not clear whether the U.S. knew at the time that this is actually an Iranian Kurdish group and not an Iraqi Kurdish group.
I feel like they probably knew that.
Actually, I'm not so sure.
No?
Yeah. Look, at the time, they may have been part of a larger Iraqi Kurdish setting. If you knew a little bit about the leadership and you knew the names, you would immediately understand that they're actually Iranian, but nevertheless. Look, don't underestimate how little we know and how huge U.S. mistakes in Iraq were.
A few of those.
Yes.
Few or 10 or 20 or 100 for sure. I'm with you there. But sometimes it feels like, not even to put on a tinfoil hat, it feels like there were just so many other almost like sinister motives on the United States part as it related to what they really wanted to do in Iraq after getting there, that, they would be willing to make quote unquote unholy alliances or things like that. No?
I mean, you mentioned the MEK earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
MEK is an organization that was founded in Iran in 1963. It was a very bizarre origin story or bizarre creation in the sense that these were highly religious Shia Muslims that at the same time were Marxist. So they became actually a rather popular group in Iran during the 60s and 70s because they were the most radical. They fought the Shah. They were the ones who started to use violence against the Shah's regime. And the Shah's regime was very, very unpopular.
Would they do like political assassinations?
They did. They tried to assassinate the Shah. They killed, I believe, 6 or 7 Americans in the 1970s. Because the US, of course, was behind the Shah, so they became a target of this group. Then later on, they were part of the revolution. They were in an alliance with Ayatollah Khomeini, but it was an uneasy alliance. And as soon as the revolution was completed in the sense that the Shah was out, infighting between them started. It was a very violent struggle between the MEK and what is now the actual regime. And they fled to Iraq. And Saddam Hussein had invaded Iran. So they ended up siding with the country that was invading the country.
That was okay, even though Saddam was a Sunni? He accepted them?
So these different things are not that important, to be frank with you. This, I think from a U.S. standpoint, because of how we messed up Iraq, we've kind of overstudied, the sectarian element. And the sectarian element, I'm not saying that it's irrelevant, but it became much more relevant later on than it was back then. The fact that they were an Iranian group was much more of a problem for Saddam, but he needed that Iranian group against the Iranian government at the time. But this also meant that the MEK then started to dramatically lose credibility and support. Because, imagine an American that would have fought with Al-Qaeda on 9/11. It's seen as completely treacherous. And they landed on the US's terrorist list because of the terrorist activities they had engaged in, particularly for Saddam Hussein. They were massacring Shias in the south. They were massacring Kurds. The CIA described them as Saddam Hussein's essentially.
আসসালামু আলাইকুম ওয়া রাহমাতুল্লাহি ওয়া বারাকাতুহু। বাসায় একজন গেস্ট এসেছেন হঠাৎ করেই, তো ওনাকে কি নাস্তা দেয়া যায়, তো এটা নিয়ে আমাকে খুব টেনশন করতে হয় না। আমাদের মোটামুটি সুটকারি রুতা
cheat or can they not cheat? Is it safe? Is this not safe? And that's why it took such a long time before the Obama White House came new. So the idea that this was like rushed or that it wasn't really thought through, it was amazingly well thought through by nuclear scientists. Towards the end of the negotiations, it became so technical that alive. I spoke to one guy who was out in the protests. He'd been out in almost every protest since 2009, not a fan of the regime. And he said, back in 2009, if we saw someone start using violence, everyone intervened because we really kept a very strong nonviolent discipline. This time around, he said, I saw these folks. I don't know who they are, but they were all dressed in black. They seemed to be professional. They seemed to know what they're doing. They were acting very fast. And I didn't have, and no one else had the guts to step in because frankly, we were as afraid of them as we were of the besieged. So there was something else going on. It doesn't in any way justify this massive killing by the government.
Right.
But something else was going on that we have not seen before that led to a counter-violence, that led to these 300 police being killed, etc. And, why would you go burn fire trucks? What are you aiming to do? Right? Yeah. Particularly since you are at the same time putting a lot of buildings on fire.
You're also giving propaganda to the government to use.
You are giving. So, there's a suspicion what he's actually done by the government itself in order to discredit the protests, etc. Right. So there's a lot of question marks. And one of the things that happened, certainly by January 8th, but had already started, is that in the beginning when those protests started, was in the middle of the day, and it was these currency and tradesmen that were out there protesting because the collapse of the currency was in the day. By January 8th, all the protesters are at night. At night is much more difficult to see what's going on. It's difficult to see who's doing what. And it also makes it much more easy. If there is an element that wants to take advantage of massive protests to be able to pursue a different type of approach, which is, and I assume that if they're completely homegrown, their belief is this regime is not going to be overthrown by peaceful protest. There needs to be some sort of a response to them that is not just peaceful. Or if it is something that is supported by outside elements, and we know that the Mossad had a tremendous amount of presence in Iran in the summer war. So if it's that, then, it's something. But bottom line is, this guy who went to all of these protests was like, whoa, I've not seen this before. And he actually ended up going home because it was like, okay, this made me uncomfortable. I want to protest the government. I want to, but anything that uses my presence in order to go towards something that could lead to civil war, for instance, he didn't want to have a part of it.
So this is also a major difference between like what happened in 2022.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Then you had massive violence from the government itself. You did not. I mean, look, the main elements of those protests were teenage kids.
Yeah.
And young women, right? So no, not a demographic that is prone to that type of a violence, right?
Mm.
So no, this is new. And this is, again, part of the shock. I mean, the biggest shock clearly is the massive killings by the government.
Yeah.
But also that there's something else. And it has scared a lot of people. And I think my dad is one of those who's he's not in favor of military intervention by the United States or anyone else. I'm certainly not either. I'm against it from both sides, from the standpoint of Iran, but also from the standpoint of the United States. After seeing what the U.S. have done and what it's cost the U.S. itself, I'm not in favor of it. But the fear of civil war, I think, is also very tangible at this point.
So what do you mean from the standpoint of Iran as well? As
in the sense that I don't believe that foreign intervention will ultimately lead to democracy. And I think democracy is where things should be going. And foreign intervention, and frankly, you mentioned the son of the Shah. If you look at the strategy that he's pursuing,
Reza Pahlavi,
it does not leave me with the impression that he actually is seeking an internal overthrow of the government. If you were to do that, you would build a big coalition. He's not. You would be going the extra mile to get amnesty to people from within the IRGC in order to get defections. Because you have a massive security establishment and you need to get them to defect. You cannot just beat them, particularly when you don't have an army, right? But he's not doing that either. He's talking about it, but his supporters, and you will see them in the comment sections on YouTube later on, are not building this thing and are not pursuing that type of an approach. Instead, what they're pursuing is the same thing as Machado did, which is Trump, make me the king.
Right.
Install me. And we started off with 1953. And now we're 2026. I don't think going that full circle is the right thing.
Do you know him?
I've met him.
With him.
Yeah. I've not had a lengthy conversation, but I met him. Yeah.
When?
I think the first time is the one that I do remember. He gave a briefing on Capitol Hill when I was working there. And I do remember it well because I was not left impressed. And he looked very uncomfortable and uncertain and was constantly leaning over to some of his handlers to see, am I doing a good job or not?
His handlers.
Yeah, that's the way it looked like. And that's not to question his motives, which at the time I don't think were what they are today. I mean, at this point, he's very clearly, explicitly pushing for U.S. and Israeli military intervention. I think that's absolutely wrong. But also because there was a moment in which the congressman asked him, so what do I call you? Do I say Mr. Pahlavi? And he responded saying, Your Majesty would work.
That don't play well in America. We don't.
Yeah, it doesn't. But also it doesn't work well if you're saying, hey, I'm actually not going to try to take over the country. I'm just going to handle the transition to a democratic government. Well, then the title Majesty should not be part of the mix.
Yeah. Power is a very, very strange thing. And in an ideal world, power goes to the people who actually at least want it. And that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, that's the way it should be. Yeah.
That's the way it should be.
Yeah.
And
it's Sam and Frodo at Mount Doom.
Yes, exactly. That's a great way to put it. And with him, I don't even say this to be a cynic, but like the guy has lived as a guest of the United States government since he was 19 years old. That shit ain't free. You know what I mean? And I understand, like, by the way, like seeing it from my government's perspective, they would love a world where it's not the current regime there.
Mm.
I'm with them. But I really appreciate your, even with your own history, like understanding the serious problems there could be if it's caused from outside. And you had said something early on in this conversation, then we got off it, but you were talking about, you know, the dangers of revolutions on the other side and how they often look, and it's not necessarily like the American one, and you're right about that. But like an example of one that the world kind of blew, in addition to the country itself, that could have been good, was when the USSR was overthrown.
Mm.
Of course, there was intelligence involved there. That's just the nature of the world. I'm cool with that. That's what they do. But roughly 15%.
أنا نسمع نازحة من معسكر جباليا
Of the population there overthrew that government. It wasn't 50.
Yeah.
It wasn't 40.
Yeah.
It was 15, largely peacefully.
Yeah.
The aftermath, a lot of diplomacy was fucked up, for sure, and that United States deserves blame for that. European countries deserve blame for that and everything. And of course, the new Russian government deserves blame for that. And the way that they set up the country was not smart. And here we are 30 years later. But to me, like, just cut it off when they took down the wall and took down USSR. Up to that point, it's like, all right, if you're going to do it, that internal way, that's the way. And that's the way, like, something like Iran in an ideal world should happen. And then you just hope the world and the new people taking over Iran at that point will have learned the lessons of the past. They almost never do, cynically, but like, and realize, okay, let's not do the same things we did with the USSR, move into Russia, and let's have some sort of like, you know, new democratic system in this country that actually works, that's self-sustaining, and, you know, is like some sort of slow burn into the future. Is that fair to say?
It is, but I think we have to be clear though. Look, countries have their interests, right?
Uh-huh.
If you have a vacuum created in Iran and some sort of a new formation may be formed, new government, new system. If you're sitting in Turkey, in Saudi, in Russia, in the US, in Israel, you're not going to sit there on the sidelines and be like, well, let's just hope for the best. That's just not the way it works. Now, there's a spectrum. There's countries that may interfere very aggressively, completely overdo it. Others who may play a smaller role, but, you know, reality is it's going to affect them. So it's not illegitimate for them to be concerned. It may be illegitimate for them to intervene in a very problematic way, of course. And when it comes to like a country like Iran, has 15 neighbors around itself, very strategically positioned, in a position to control the waterways of the Strait of Hormuz. 40% of all of the world's energy flows through there. You're not going to have disinterested parties. Just not going to be the case. But you can help at a minimum by making sure that you don't make it worse. And what we have seen in the region up until now, or in recent history, is that when you have Syria, for instance, the Iranians intervene, the Russians intervene, the Qataris, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Turks. And studies show that most civil wars actually cannot last for more than about a year. For a very simple reason, that you run out of weapons and ammunition. The cases in which they go on for longer, and the Syrian case went on for about 15 years, is because of foreign military intervention.
Right. There were like fucking 20 groups there.
Exactly. Well, actually, at one point it was 1,455 groups.
20 main ones, I'm sorry. I was a little off on my math. Point taken.
So you have all of these countries trying to, starting to play their competition with each other inside of Syrian territory. Same thing happened in Yemen, the Saudis and the Iranians. And in Iraq, the Saudis, the US, and the Iranians again. And the Turks were involved there as well, of course. And it just ends up, it doesn't matter if any of them had good intentions. Does not matter. It just ends up ruining those countries. And Syria is completely ruined to the point that they're welcoming a former Al-Qaeda head as president because
Playing basketball with U.S. Congress.
better than what it was before, apparently. Okay, I'm not going to judge it. It's their call. I'm personally skeptical, but if it ends up working out well for them, then fine. What I'm mostly taken aback by is the speed in which the U.S. went from having him $20 million on his head to not only playing basketball with U.S. military, but David Petraeus on the stage asking him, "Are you sleeping well at night?
Was
Can we
that
help
the
you?"
best?
I mean, it's
Was
just
that the best? Oh
whatever
my God.
conspiracy existed in the region, and there's plenty of conspiracies in the region that says the U.S. was behind ISIS and Al-Qaeda, etc. I don't think there's any truth to them, just to be clear. But rest assured, they got a huge boost after seeing what's Petraeus being that chummy with the guy.
Yeah, that was one of the cringiest things. It's like just optically, Petraeus has got to be like, all right, someone else go on stage with him. You know, he's already president. Just somebody else do it. Like, Jesus,
There's got to be someone.
Got to be find some diplomat on K Street. They'll do it. But yeah, I think that's also like you raised the point about the Saudis here. I kind of forget that. That's a mistake on my part because there's been all these proxy wars in the Middle East where it's Iran versus Saudi. And you mentioned one with Yemen, which is effectively that's what that's been.
Yeah.
So as it relates to the current protests, like what, you know, we focus on the US, Israel, and Iran with this, and I guess a little bit of Qatar. Are the Saudis playing some roles right now as to what's going on in Iran? And how so?
So very interesting what has happened in the region now. So, you know, the Saudis and the Iranians have long-standing competition. The Saudis always, during the time of the Shah, felt that the Iranians were, you know, very arrogant against them and treated them as, you know, quite inferior. And there's some justification for some of their criticisms. But then when the revolution happens, it actually becomes much worse because now the Shah viewed himself as the superpower of the region. And, you know, he had convinced Richard Nixon to exit the region militarily and let Iran essentially take care of the security of the region of the Persian Gulf. And Saudi Arabia was like a junior partner in that. It was called the twin pillar policy, but it was really just an Iranian pillar to it. By the time the Khomeini government comes in during the Islamic Republic, they actually take on a very hostile position towards the Saudis. They want to overthrow all of the kingdoms. They had overthrown their monarchy, and it was Iran that was the regime change advocate back then, and they wanted to overthrow all of the kingdoms. And they particularly targeted Saudi Arabia because Saudi also was a U.S. ally, and Saudi was the center of Islam because that's where Mecca and Medina. So Khomeini goes on constant attack. He accuses the Saudis of practicing American Islam. So this was really the deepest American Islam. It was like the deepest insult, essentially saying, you're not legitimate. You're not the legitimate leader of the Islamic world. So things got really bad. And the Saudis were
mayor of Minneapolis.
And, you know, the Saudis, together with the Kuwaitis and others, were funding all of Saddam's military expenses. So it was really most of the GCC and at war with Iran indirectly during that war. But then they had their ups and downs. Now we're in one of their ups. Since 2022, guess who? The Chinese mediated and got a normalization agreement between the two sides. A lot of legwork had been done by Oman and Iraq, but the last 10% of the distance was taken by the Chinese. And this is the first time the Chinese step into the meet.
So